at Houston, and I'm honored to serve on the committee that is bringing you this three-part forum. This forum is one an educational and academic setting where we are going to hear from community leaders, civic influencers, and people who have historians and people from the area who have experienced the history of the city and its diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And we're going to use that historic context to frame our discussion for the next couple of weeks to understand the state of Dallas in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we collectively can build a strategy and a plan for the future. Before I get started, I would like to also provide a couple of ground rules or things of that nature. One, like I said earlier, this is a conversation. This is not a debate. Our purpose is not to prove one side is right or not. Whether you are a historically marginalized a community member or you're in a space where there's been privilege in Dallas in its history, this discussion isn't to prove who's right or wrong. This discussion is to illuminate the historical perspective and things that were done and its reactions and its consequences afterwards. And so as we are navigating the next 6 hours, 2 hours this Thursday, 2 hours next Thursday, and 2 hours the following Thursday on June the 10th, we are going to have this exploratory space so that we can build as a city and become the international destination across the globe. With that being said, I am honored to introduce to you the person who's head of our academic space at the University of North Texas at Dallas, our provost, Dr. Betty Stewart. Dr. Stewart.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the Search Institute at the University of North Texas at Dallas, Dallas College, and our collaborative partners for developing this three-part series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Your willingness to have discussions around this important topic speaks to the progress we're making as citizens of Dallas, the state of Texas, and this country. We live in a diverse nation composed of immigrants from all over the world. Many immigrants came to this country seeking a better way of life. Others did not. When I was a child, I was taught in school that America was referred to as a melting pot, a place where a variety of peoples, cultures, or individuals assimilate into a cohesive whole. The melting pot terminology comes from the idea that all of the cultural differences in this country meld together as if they were metals being melted down to become a stronger alloy. While it's true that there are many cultures within this nation, this state, and this city, this melting pot terminology is not always evident in social, economic, and governmental policies all around us, and in the places in which we live, learn, work, and play. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are three words whose importance have grown significantly over the past decade and have become even more important in this country with the high-profile, senseless deaths of people of color over the past 12 months. Let us not mistakenly believe that where there is diversity, there is equity and inclusion. Diversity is used to describe all the ways in which people differ, not just race and gender. Equity is about creating fair access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, where one's identity cannot predict the outcome. Inclusion is where a variety of people feel a sense of belonging and value, where they have power, a voice, and decision-making authority. To have the courageous conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are compelled to look at ourselves, our city, our state, and our nation. My hope for this series of forums is that both participants and panelists use this opportunity to truly have those candid conversations, to acknowledge and learn from the past, to turn our focus on correcting the present, and use this as a call to personal action. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to greet you today, and I look forward to an informative and productive forum.
Thank you, Provost Stewart. Thank you very much for your words. Thank you for your vision, but most importantly, thank you for your actions as you are able to provide not only an academic opportunity for our community to enhance our lives, but also you're creating spaces outside of the classroom so that we can develop as a culture. So thank you very much. Next, I am honored to introduce to you an individual who I've worked with in the community for several years, with partnerships with community organizations and Dallas College. Dr. Justin Lanone, who is the Executive Vice Chancellor over operations, has been key in not only building infrastructure within Dallas College to serve our community, but also is providing a strategy so that we can have a great workforce, appropriate workforce for our city's needs. Dr. Lanone, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you all for being here today. It's really an honor for Dallas College to be a part of this conversation that is so critical in our community. We really appreciate the partnership and collaboration with UNT on this initiative and so many others in our community. And I'll just tell you that this conversation is one that Dallas College as an institution has been on a journey for some time and continues to accelerate that journey. And so we have done some things over the last few years to help better understanding along these topics, and did a survey, a diversity, equity, inclusion survey of all of our employees to get a sense of how they felt about where we were as an institution, and engage some outside expertise to help us along this way. And really proud of some of the work we've done to create employee resource groups that can serve as network and support opportunities for our employees. And then really under the leadership of our then board chair, Deanna Flores, established a diversity, equity, inclusion committee of our board. And that has continued on with our current board chair, Monica Lura Bravo. And another outgrowth of all of this work and attention and focus was the creation of the Office of Social Responsibility, and really to have a home and a focus and attention on what had existed previously of parts of this work at different parts of the institution, but to really lead us. And so we're excited about the work that's going on there. But we also see, our role within the external community. We are your community college, Dallas College. And so working with our partners within the community, and that's what's so exciting about what has been organized today, to have this panel of leaders and experts in the space, and such good friends and supporters like Matt, like Renee, and the rest of the team and the group. It's, so really looking forward to this dialogue and conversation today. But, as we created the Office of Social Responsibility, we recognize it's not just an office. This is a responsibility for all of us in leadership, to foster these conversations, be very intentional about the work in this space. And I think it's also, a significant role of colleges and universities to engage in this. So we have the unique opportunity to engage, directly and indirectly with those whose lives have traditionally been impacted and marginalized by this country and this community, but quite frankly, also those who are more recent on their personal journey to gain greater understanding of these topics and issues. So it's great to see these kind of conversations going on amongst places of education and learning. And that's not something that we take lightly here at Dallas College. And so we're continuing to fully support and embrace. So everyone has a more equitable future, and that we're forced to take a look at our past to better understand our present and to plan better for our future, to provide more opportunity for everyone, for all, which is what Dallas College represents. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. Appreciate the Dallas College as an opportunity to be a part of it. And so really just thank you on behalf of all of Dallas College for the work and the engagement in this space and topic, and know that it's going to be a great discussion and a constructive dialogue to look for equitable actions and solutions for everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Leno. I appreciate it. All right, I was waiting on my camera to start. And also, this is a great time to kick off how we will start our candid cross-cultural conversation. I wanted to make sure I got the title correct. I know I flubbed it a brief second at the very beginning of our session. Please provide grace as we are all working together in the next 2 hours to build our city. And the person who's going to shepherd us through this process is our moderator, Ms. Kimberly O'Neill. Kimberly O'Neill is an award-winning professor, executive leader, and social good expert who served as the youngest African-American female city manager in the United States. As a veteran senior government and nonprofit executive, she has led activities that have generated more than $20 million for community initiatives, negotiated major urban economic development projects, and used her voice to impact public policy decisions while lobbying in New York City and on Capitol Hill. This individual has moved to Texas these last several years, worked here, and have done amazing strides, have done amazing things in our community, not only in Dallas County, but in the North Texas region. And I am honored that she is facilitating this discussion. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to Miss Kimberly O'Neill, who will tell you all the rest of the program.
Thank you, Matt, and happy Thursday to everyone. I always stumble on that when I'm thinking about the days of the week now during the pandemic, but I'm honored and grateful and excited to lead this conversation today and to help moderate the discussions that we honestly need to have. Before coming to Texas, I bring with me more than 30 years of community work, and 10 years was spent on working in equity and inclusion, with my work and recommendations on federal record in the Department of Justice for a federal court case against the largest city in this country where the plaintiffs did. But as a professor and a forever student of history, I travel this country just researching and studying the things that have happened historically. And one of the things that I often fail to see is this level of conversation where we talk about equity and inclusion, but first we talk about what has happened historically. So I'm glad that we're starting off today in this way, and I'm glad that we're starting off with the presenters that we have. Our structure for today, we will have 4 presentations that will last approximately 15 to 20 minutes each. If you have questions from any of the presenters as we go throughout the day, please make sure that you're posting your questions in the Q&A section, not the chat, but in the Q&A section, because we will save time at the end for me to go and feel through those questions and bring them to the floor and ask our presenters so that we can get some great answers for you all. But you know what? This is the only true way for us to move forward, for us to really understand. And the power of academia, bringing this together today, does 3 things that I would jot it down. 1, it's going to help us to shift the narrative. 2, it's going to help us to strengthen the conversation. And lastly, this is going to contribute to the needs of the community. And that's what we have to get down to. And leading us off in conversation today in terms of presentation will be Dr. W. Marvin Delaney. Dr. Delaney is Deputy Director and Chief Operations Officer for the Dallas African American Museum. Before joining the museum in March of 2020, he was Associate Professor of History Emeritus, former interim Director of the Center for African American Studies, and the former Chair of the Department of History at the University of Texas, Arlington. He is a graduate of Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in History, magna cum laude. He earned his Master's of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in American and African American History at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and he is a native of Alliance, Ohio. Without further ado, I am going to open the floor this morning for a presentation by Dr. Delaney. Dr. Delaney, thank you for being here this morning, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Ms. O'Neill. Let me see if I can share my screen and pull up a PowerPoint. No, that doesn't look like it's going to work. Matt, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. I'm still with you. We'll have our administrators look for William Delaney. I think they were looking for Marvin on your screen. So we will look to allow you to become a co-host. But while we're doing that, would you give us a little bit tell us a little bit about yourself and your history in Dallas and your work at UTA and the African American Museum?
Sure. I have been teaching for 42 years. I'm teaching American and African American history and teaching African American history primarily. And one of the things I've done, of course, is look at the history of the city of Dallas, particularly the experience of African Americans in the city of Dallas. I've been here for 40 years in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And again, being a researcher, being a scholar, being someone interested in local history, I've spent a lot of time looking at things such as housing, policing, education, and of course, politics. And what I found is that, Dallas has been like most urban areas in that African Americans have been marginalized, second-class citizens, along with Mexican Americans. Indeed, perhaps the major differences of Dallas from, say, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York City. It's the presence of another major ethnic group, Mexican Americans, all who face housing discrimination, education discrimination, political discrimination, and so on. Dallas, though, is sort of unique because when I first came here in 1981, the narrative was that racism wasn't a factor here, that Dallas was more of a Western city than a Southern city. So therefore, the narrative was Dallas didn't need a civil rights movement. Dallas was not like Birmingham and Atlanta and other Southern cities. So you get there was a book published, for example, in 1987 called The Accommodation by a local journalist. And of course, he basically he actually was sort of wrong in his presentation in the book. As his thesis was that African American leadership in Dallas had accommodated the white leaders so that there was no civil rights movement. There were no riots. There was no struggle per se in the city of Dallas, such as in Birmingham and Atlanta and in other parts of the South. Of course, all that was a false narrative. And what I found by doing my own research was Dallas was actually very important in terms of the civil rights movement, not only in the state of Texas, but throughout the South.
Great. Dr. Delaney, just FYI, you should have hosting capabilities. So if you want to share, you can do that.
Okay. Let's see. All right. Okay, so there we go. There we go. Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay, good. Let's see. Slideshow. It just go through. Okay. If you can see the screen, indeed focuses on or shows uh, a couple of the points that I just made about the myths here in the city that civil rights was not needed. There were no riots or racial violence and so on. But the reality was, as you see here, Dallas was as segregated as any city in the Old South. And you see the areas in which there was segregation. In fact, almost every aspect of public life going forward, even in terms of where African Americans settled. This is a map of African Americans here in Dallas and their neighborhoods in 1940 and in 1970. And of course, we see the specific African American neighborhoods that existed in Dallas in the late 19th and early 20th century, and even to a certain extent today. Let's see, Dallas, of course, was a hotbed for the Ku Klux Klan, just as the remainder of the state of Texas. There was even a major lynching here in Dallas in 1910. And of course, segregation was the rule of the day. And you see, there's even such a sign as no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans here in the city of Dallas. And of course, you see this is from 1942. We serve whites only, no Spanish, no Mexican. So you see, there's just this long tradition of segregation. And of course, you get a terrible amusement at the Texas State Fair, in which indeed they use the N-word and we're not apologetic about it. One of the major areas of segregation and discrimination was, of course, in voting, and that all of these methods were used to disfranchise African American voters. And I point this out because indeed we see today this attempt to disfranchise African American voters. Of course, this is the 1905 law that excluded African Americans from the Democratic Party's library. One area of importance, of course, was education. Of course, education was segregated. In 1922, Booker T. Washington was the only high school available to African Americans. And by the 1930s, African Americans have outgrown Booker T. Washington High School, with students having to go to Booker T. Washington in 3 shifts because there was not a second high school for African Americans. These two men, though, began a movement in the 1930s to change that. They formed a progressive voting league, progressive voters league, and I'll show that shortly. But they also pushed the idea that African Americans had to engage in citizenship activities and civic activities. One of the things that you see they may still be saying here is that African Americans must register to vote. In 1935, it was a unique opportunity for African Americans to run for the state legislature. Sarah T. Hughes here, as you see, she was a state legislature in 1935, and as you see, she was sworn in Lyndon Johnson in 1963, but she indeed received an appointment as a federal judge in 1935, and this opened up her seat for other African Americans to actually run for that office. And it was a sort of a very exciting event, so much so that it upset the local Ku Klux Klan that tried to discourage Hammond Wells from running for that particular office. But it was important because it got African Americans engaged in politics. I mentioned the Progressive Voters League formed in 1936, and it formed to address the needs of the African American community. Another high school, more housing for African Americans, and of course the appointment of what they called in those days Negro police. And they actually were successful in influencing that election, and they indeed got some of the things that they needed. As you see here, they got a new high school, Lincoln High School. They got a new housing project, Wilson Homes. They got city jobs. Of course, they did not get the black police officer that they needed. One of the cases, as I pointed out, that showed the national influence of the movement in Dallas was the Smith versus Allwright case. Now, the Democratic Party, as I showed earlier, discriminated against African Americans throughout the state of Texas. So starting in the 1930s, African Americans filed lawsuits against the Texas state primary. And again, let me make the point. The Democratic Party at that time was the only game in town. So if you won the primary, you were pretty sure that you'd win the general election in November. And so in this case, a Thurgood Marshall and a local attorney named W.J. Durham filed a lawsuit and won the case of Smith versus Allwright that overturned that white primary. And it had, as I said, a very strong regional effect in that the white primary being defeated in Texas, then fell in Georgia, then fell in South Carolina, then fell also in Florida. So this case, Smith versus Allwright, which many people don't know anything about, perhaps one of the most important cases in the South in the 1940s. Again, this is an article talking about how this decision was just very important in terms of improving participation of African Americans and voting in the South. Okay. One of the issues that really affected African Americans was housing. Once Lincoln High School, for example, was built in South Dallas in 1939, or in an opened in 1939, it encouraged African Americans to move closer to it in South Dallas. And of course, violating this imaginary racial line that separated the African American community from the white community. And so indeed, between 1940 and 42, 20 homes of African Americans were bombed in South Dallas. The city council and the mayor solved the issue by buying those African Americans out, and indeed forced them to move away from that area. But this issue continued into the 1950s. And so there's another series of bombing of African American homes in 1950 and 51 in South Dallas. Finally, the city council and local white businessmen built a housing project in North Dallas called Hamilton Park. And as you see, they celebrated the 50th anniversary of Hamilton Park in 2003. All right, I'm going to stop there and not take up any more time. So, Matt, I'll release the stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Delaney. I actually have noted a number of questions for you that I will, if you have any questions for Dr. Delaney, please make sure you're putting them in the Q&A forum so that towards the end today, we can address them. But I have a number of questions as well that I'm holding off for. I think it helped to shape the framework of our conversation today and the conversations that we need to have around why equity and inclusion is important, but why understanding the history of the past is important in order to get the justice so that we can move forward with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I want to thank you for your time so far this morning. But I'm just going to ask you to put a pin in that and don't get too comfortable, because we will definitely come back to you towards the end of our session today. So I want to thank you for that. And then next we have Dr. Roberto Calderon is going to be next on our panel this morning for discussions. And if I can ask our tech support team to make sure that Dr. Calderon has co-host access so that he can pull his presentation up. Thank you very much. And I am going to do a brief introduction because I think that the people we have here are very powerful, and we want to make sure that we know as much as we can as they move into their presentations. Roberto R. Calderon is an associate professor of history at the University of North Texas. His most recent book was with Manuel Garcia and Griego, and he also, in 1984, he published an edited volume of a book called South Texas Coal Mining, A Community History, with funding from a National Endowment for the Humanities Youth Grant. In 1978, he co-edited a volume of Chicana and Latina poetry and prose at Brown University, and he was the first. It was the first literary volume published by Latino students in Brown University's history. His current work includes completing a history tentatively titled Border Crucible, Tejano Politics in Laredo, 1845 to 1911. The second project involves an anthology currently titled Forjando Destino, Mexican Americans in North Texas, and he is the founding director and faculty advisor for the Mexican American Studies academic minor at the University of North Texas, and he's also the editor of the University of North Texas Press of Al Filo Mexican American Student Studies Series. Dr. Calderon, I'm going to turn it over to you for your time this morning, and you will have 15 to 20 minutes to present as well. Again, to our audience with us today, please be sure as you're taking notes, if you have questions for Dr. Calderon, also make sure you're including those in the Q&A box as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. O'Neill. I will read my presentation and try and hopefully get it all in. I wish to thank those responsible for inviting me to present these brief remarks today at this virtual seminar, and especially my colleagues, Diana Flores and Matthew Houston, for reaching out and making this happen. We gather in a year and a political season nationally and statewide in which significant events and policies impinging on the telling of history and all of its complicated facets behoove us to stand up and make our voices heard. Peoples who have lost their fear of fighting for justice because they know and believe it to be true cannot go back to the way things were. This much was said in an important speech by Cesar Chavez in 1984 titled Address to the Commonwealth Club of California, and we quote the relevant words. He stated, "These trends are part of the forces of history that cannot be stopped. No person and no organization can resist them for very long. They are inevitable. Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride, and you cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore," unquote. And indeed, historians believe in the clarifying power of trends in the lives of ordinary people. We are here to discuss a few of these trends in the context of Dallas's past, and therein the history of Mexican peoples regardless of borders. Rather, we invoke the historical and cultural concept of Greater Mexico, which one of the pioneers of Chicano studies here in Texas, Dr. Americo Paredes, once so elegantly explained. It is our hope that these brief remarks bring a clearer picture of who we are and inspire and educate others to stand up and be heard when it matters most. We are, after all, North Texas strong. It is important to recall that the word Mexico and Mexican are rooted in indigenous reality. Mexicans, regardless of their present resident status in the US, are grounded in their indigenous past. And this is not something that may be lost even when forces of acculturation and assimilation would have us believe otherwise. This part of who we are, of our past, cannot be denied. Rather, the descendants of those who colonized Mexico, including those who form part of US history, have historically used the fact of Mexican indigeneity to promote and further a virulent anti-Mexicanism as a tool of oppression, past and present. As my colleagues who were my elders in the Chicano movement might have said on more than one occasion, I am not an immigrant. Who defines who is and who is not an immigrant? Though Mexicans be mestizos, they are ultimately peoples who are of this hemisphere, this continent. We belong here. This is our home. This land may or may not be legally ours today, but it calls our name and carries the spirit memory of the ancestors. The point bears remembering. The mid 19th century, the mid 19th, early and let's see, um, the mid 19th century, early and mid 19th century wars, the 1835-36 and 1846-48 wars between Mexico and the U.S. led eventually to the combined loss for Mexico of more than half of the territory it claimed. This was territory that gave the U.S. its ocean-to-ocean continent-wide grip on the land and its resources. By the conclusion of the Second War in 1848, through the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, those approximately 100,000 Mexicans remaining in what used to be Mexico's far north and eventually renamed the American Southwest were granted nominal citizenship under one of the treaty's clauses. And while they presumably could hold on to their lands, the change in legal systems, fraud, political chicanery, violence, and market forces, etc., led in the 50-year period by 1900 to the loss of millions of acres of land, by both large and small Mexican landowners from Alta California to Texas. By the turn of the 20th century, the Mexican community was a thoroughly proletarianized, that is, predominantly landless ethnic national minority community. Political representation was severely reduced, with New Mexico, which had the most numerous Mexican population in this era, managing to stand its ground by continuously electing their ethnic representatives to the territorial government. A demographic majority of Mexicans in the territory helped significantly, as did a long tradition, several hundred years long, of landowning. Nuevo Mexicano elites hoarded education in U.S. schools in Missouri and elsewhere, at least those who could afford the cost, in order to forge some kind of survival strategy, given a pronounced and growing Anglo hegemony. Nuevo Mexicanos continued to be a demographic majority into the early years of the 1920s, and today are again on the cusp of gaining said numerical majority. Statehood was achieved in 1912, but the Nuevo Mexicano experience bucked the trend of heightened political underrepresentation. In Texas and California, for the most part, political representation for the ethnic Mexicans dwindled, and by the 1870s in California and earlier, if not in Texas, state representation was generally lost, with the one or two exceptions here and there unable to cancel the trend. But it's important to bear in mind that today there are an estimated 40 million ethnic Mexicans in the US. And untold hundreds of thousands of these ethnic Mexicans are descended from Mexicans who have resided in what's now the US for hundreds of years, 10 generations and more. They constitute a charter community. At the same time, untold millions are more recently settled and arrived from Mexico. By comparison, in 2019, an increasingly diverse US Black population numbered 47 million, whereas the overall US Latino population in 2020 was more than 62 million. Together, these two communities currently comprise 1/3 of the US population of 334 million. Can we have table 1, please? Thanks. Advanced, thanks. Table 1 illustrates both high and low numbers of the Mexican population at the first US census of this ethnic community, at their at their first U.S. Census in 1850. Most historians since have taken the middle ground with respect to the numbers presented by Oscar J. Martinez in the late 1970s. His numbers, though, have withstood the test of time. For example, the Pew Research Center notes that the U.S. Mexican community stood at 155,000 in 1860 at the start of the Civil War. In contrast, there were nearly 4 million African Americans in the U.S. in 1860, with about 90% of them living in the U.S. South and 10% in the North. Blacks and Mexicans shared another historical experience in the U.S. by 1900, as this table's numbers clearly illustrate. Both communities were geographically concentrated, one in the South, the other in the U.S. Southwest. In effect, this was their historical homeland for the Mexicans, the Mexican far north, as it used to be called. Similarly, Blacks, because of slavery as an institution, resided predominantly in the South as late as 1900. Geographic concentration then characterized both groups of Americans at the turn of the 20th century. Table 2. Table 2 illustrates significantly that Mexicans have historically always comprised more than 60% overall of the U.S. Latino community. Only in 2 instances, once in 1980 and then again in 2000, did the percent of the overall U.S. Latino community fall under the 60% threshold. And in 1860, Mexicans comprised more than 81% of the overall U.S. Latino population. The high point in this regard, from 1850 through 1960, the percentage of the Latino community comprised by Mexicans did not drop under 70% in round figures, a period of 110 years representing well over 3 generations. The other trend, of course, is that since 1970, the percentage of non-Mexican Latinos in the U.S. has steadily increased. U.S. Mexicans share a lengthy land bridge with their historical country of origin, past and present. For better or worse, no other Latino community is able to make this claim. Table 3, and then I'll tell you when we go to 4 and 5, it's a series of 3 tables on lynching of all topics. Table 3, 4, and 5 constitute a series on the history of lynching of Mexicans by whites in the U.S. from 1848 to 1928. In the 2003 essay from which these tables are borrowed by William Carrigan and Clive Webb, 2 white historians, they note 2 key points worthy of mentioning here. First, Mexicans were subjected to extensive and continuous violence comparable to that of the African American community throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. In their respective geographic regions, the Southwest and Southeast, they met with a similar history. Moreover, in the case of the U.S. Mexican community, this history of lynching is one that prior to the publication of this essay had been overwhelmingly ignored by the respective historiographies. Instead, the extensive literature on the subject has tended to focus on the Black experience. This leads us to the second point made by the pair of historians, that is, proportionate to their population, the rate of lynching by Mexicans and Blacks was comparable. If anything, say Carrigan and Webb, they were conservative in making their argument by ensuring that documentary evidence was found to account for all 597 Mexicans lynched during the era from 1848 to 1928. An untold number of Mexicans were otherwise killed, murdered, and lynched, but the record is elusive and therefore elusive. And so these historians, at least, did not count said numbers in their own account of the violent history. They state that there were surely a greater number of Mexicans lynched than the ones they were able to prove by the evidence found. Um, Table 4 clearly indicates, see, Table 4. Oh, I'm sorry, Table 3, go back to Table 3. Table 3 clearly indicates that the lynching violence was greatest in Texas and California, followed by Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada, and a host of 7 additional states. And we quote, and I'm going to skip the quote by this historian so that we can move on to Table 4. Now, Table 4. Table 4 shows the lynching pattern Mexicans were subjected to by decades. And it is clear that 3 decades in this 80-year period stand out. In order of the greatest number of lynchings, the most terrifying decades were the 1850s, followed by the 1870s and 1910s. In all 3 decades, Mexican resistance to Anglo violence elicited an even greater violence to be directed at quelling Mexican agency. Table 5 compares the rates at which Mexicans and Blacks were lynched between 1880 and 1930. The rate for Mexicans based on the method used established that 27.4 Mexicans were lynched per 100,000 in their population. Comparably, the rate for African Americans in the same period was 37.1 lynchings per 100,000 in the population. The 2 historians note that the Mexican rate of lynching was higher than that experienced in several of the South states during this period. Table 6. Table 6 is helpful in making a couple of points worth mentioning, even if the data dates to 2014. First, unlike the national trend cited above, in the North Texas metropolitan region, Mexicans comprise a higher percent of the overall Latino population. Thus, in 2014, the metro region had a Mexican population that stood at more than 84% of the whole, followed by smaller shares of Salvadoreños, 3.9%, and Puerto Ricanos at 2.6%. Clearly, while we did not research the current actual number of Latinos in the North Texas metro region, that is 2021, we did but clearly that number, the number of Latinos in North Texas today is over 2 million. In 2014, there were 1.6 million Latinos who were ethnic Mexicans residing in the North Texas metro area. A total of 38% were foreign born, meaning that nearly 2/3 were US born. Latinos comprise more than 28% of the region's overall population, a number one would expect to be greater in the forthcoming 2020 census numbers numbers that are to be out in the next few weeks or months. And finally, this is the youngest population compared to that of existing groups, as more than 38% were under the age of 18. That's nearly 4 out of 10 in the community of Latinos. The population with the largest number of youth under 18 years of age in North Texas is comprised by Latinos. Table 7. Table 7 points to the fact that Latinos continue to lead the state in adding their number to the overall population. They may not be rewarded politically with electoral districts commensurate with this growth, making this question one to pursue legally in the courts, as it ends up being a question of civil rights. The same pattern occurred 10 years ago with the 2010 results in Texas. African Americans added the second largest number of new residents to the state's population as of July 2019, followed by whites and Asians. It's most likely that Latinos will become the plural majority in Texas once the results of the 2020 census are released and confirm as much. If not, that date is not far off, given this trend. Table 8, our final table, indicates a couple of points worth mentioning here. The first point is that in July 2019, the population of Dallas, Texas was 42% Latino, with African Americans comprising nearly 1/4 of the city's population as of 2019. The two groups combined account for 2/3 of the city's total residents. Asian, for the most part, do not live in the city, but in the surrounding suburbs. And the city's white population has decreased or continued to decrease to less than 1/3 of the total, standing at 29%. The second point has to do with something we noticed in the data of the 2010 census for the North Texas metro region's two largest cities, Dallas and Fort Worth, where their respective Latino populations are concerned. And that is, both cities exhibited a Latino population that was greater than 90% ethnic Mexican. The Latino population of both cities is on a path to becoming in the future a demographic majority akin to El Paso and San Antonio, for example. Houston, whose population in 2019 accounted for 45%, whose Latino population in 2019 accounted for 45% of the city's total, and Austin's Latino population, which stood at 34% in 2019 of the total, are on a similar path as well. It could well be that within the next so many years or couple of decades at most, this trend will result in all major cities in the state hosting a majority Latino population. And surely Mexicans will be amply represented, hopefully with continued organizing, political representation will follow suit. And I think I'm at the 20-minute mark, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calderon. I just want you to say I am blown away. I don't know if I have any space left on my notepad for the page that I have for your presentation, but the numbers alone, just especially around lynching, are extremely telling.
Yeah.
And for me, it's hard that information is known now, because it would add such a different lens on what really done to this country across communities. And so I can't wait to get to the Q&A section to kind of ask some questions around that. But I thank you for this detailed presentation, because quantitative data cannot be denied. And so I'm thankful that you were able to provide this depth for us today. So I appreciate it. You. And we are going to move forward with our next presentation from Emma Rogers. Emma Rogers is an entrepreneur who is born in Niagara Falls, New York, and completed her freshman year at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And she graduated from Texas Southern University here in Houston. She co-founded a mail order business for books, which eventually became the retail store Black Images Book Bazaar in Dallas. She supports African American authors and associations with Black Images Book Bazaar, brought commercial success and critical acclaim to numerous authors, including J. California Cooper, Edward P. Jones, E. Lynn Harris, and Edward Ball. In 1995, she founded Romance Slam Jam, an African American book genre conference event. year, she was selected as a member of the United States Information Agency Corridors of Culture team. She was an active participant in her community and has been involved with numerous organizations. She served on the board of several boards, and she also teaches classes at an annual day camp. Was the director of the Dallas Civil Rights Center, and she serves as an advisory board member for Black Writers Alliance. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ms. Rogers, and thank you for your time again this morning.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ms. O'Neill, for that introduction. I want to build upon something that Dr. Delaney mentioned earlier about the accommodation. It's a book written by Jim Schultz, and Black Images was in Wynwood, and he went to Taylor. Let me give you some. He went to Taylor Publishing Company. Taylor Publishing Company here in Dallas publishes yearbook. Well, they sold that business to a newcomer. And so they were about to publish Jim Schultz, The Accommodation. And the full title of the book, as I have it right here, is Accommodation, The Politics of Race in an American City, and it's Dallas. And so the new owners were threatened by the powers that be, and they told them, if you publish Accommodation, you will never publish another yearbook. They were threatened. So as a consequence, he was able to find another publisher, Lyle Stewart in Secaucus, New Jersey. So we had and the book came out in February of 1987. I can remember because I was pregnant. My daughter is 33 now, be 34 soon. But anyway, we sold over like 180 books at that signing because everybody knew that the powers that be had threatened Taylor Publishing Company. So everybody came out to support it. And it is still a book in much demand. So if you have a chance to get it, you will learn a lot about The Accommodation. Then in addition, I want to build upon what Dr. Delaney said. He talked about, he showed a slide of A. Maceo Smith. Maybe, let me see if, can y'all go to the A. Maceo Smith slide? Let's see. Well, I'll just go on and talk. Maybe my slides will come up later. I'm not as technologically savvy as some other people on today's. Oh, go on to the top.
My apologies, Ms. Rogers. That
Okay.
was on another presentation. We don't have that available. I can receive whatever pictures. I can Google it if you need me to.
Why don't I send you? Can I forward you the email with that information in it?
I have your presentation up already.
Okay.
Yes. But do you see it on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Well, I tell you what. Are you able to change it from one slide to another?
Yes, I am managing your slides.
Thank you. Okay. Well, we'll just start right here with the Bishop Arts Theater Center. I'm really involved in the arts, and so one thing I want to say about the Bishop Arts Theater Center is that it has really done well during COVID. We launched a Storytime at Bedtime series to help parents cope since we were all sheltered in place. And it was my idea, and the board went along with it. And as a consequence, I got a Heroes Award from D Magazine last year for starting Storytime at Bedtime. But one thing I want to say, Blacks, Indigenous people, and people of color make up 37% of the U.S. population. This was in 2017. Yet they only receive 4% of foundation funding. So in the wake of, in this age of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and in the wake of the George Floyd murder, some foundations are coming on board, and we have some good news to share later, that some of our building debt will be retired. But the Bishop Arts Theater is in Oak Cliff. It's 215 South Tyler Street, and they have great programming, great jazz, a summer program. They have many things for the family. Okay, could we go to the next slide, please? All right, Derek Bell. Derek Bell he's deceased now. He was a professor at Harvard Law School. And because he was a tenured professor at Harvard Law School, and because they would not tenure Patricia Williams at Harvard, he left. He quit and he went to another university. So he's written this book called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. Space Traders is one of the stories in it. And I would suggest that you Google it and look for it online, because one of it was made into a film. The other thing is that Bell is part of the group responsible for critical race theory, which examines social, cultural, and legal issues as they relate to race and racism. And as a consequence of that, I'm involved with a group. Just a minute. I'm involved with conducting some studies on racism, white supremacy, and racism. And it's a study group that we've launched in our church in the North Texas, Northern Louisiana Synod. And we're doing Derek Bell's book and studying critical race theory. Okay. So let me tell you about when Derek Bell came to the bookstore. Side was supposed to be at 7:00. His plane was late. And I told the crowd there, and they said, well, I said, well, go to dinner. They went to dinner, and they came back about 9, and all the people came back, which was amazing, because Derek Bell has been such a champion of critical race theory. So they were there to see him. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, building on what Dr. Delaney talked about, the State Fair of Texas. So may I have the next slide? Okay, this is A. Maceo Smith. The Texas Centennial was in 1936. And so there was a Negro Hall of State. And he got funding outside of the white establishment for that building. He was able to go to the government and get it, because the State Fair of Texas was getting funding from the federal government. So he went outside, he worked in government, so he knew how to do that, and he was able to get funding. And the Hall of State in that particular building, the Negro building, they had art, they had a lot of things. But one thing they had was work by Jacob Lawrence. He did 4 panels. But after the State Fair ended that year, the Texas Centennial Commission chose to demolish the Hall of Negro Life in the spring of 1937. The community tried to raise funds to keep it, but they could not. And so along with the demolition, now, and Jacob Lawrence is a famous African-American artist. But along with the demolition, 2 were destroyed. And so there is a book called Educational Tour Through the Hall of Negro Life that you can see to see all of the panels that were part of it. Aaron Douglas, I said Jacob Lawrence, pardon me, I meant Aaron Douglas, excuse me. So that was destroyed, and that's very unfortunate. But the African American Museum in Fair Park, which Dr. Delaney is the deputy director, I think I got your title right, Dr. Delaney. It sits on that property where the Negro Life Museum was. Okay. And then, Matt, could you go to the slide with Miss Craft, Miss Juanita Craft? We'll come back to that one. Okay. Now, Miss Juanita Craft was very influential, because at when the State Fair of Texas was held, Blacks could only go to the State Fair. Oh, they could only go out there on Negro Day. And, the fair runs for 2 to 3 weeks. And so, but Blacks could only go out there on Negro Day. So Miss Craft, who's a member of the NAACP and later became a member of the Dallas City Council, she nurtured her students who were in the NAACP. They protested the fair. And some of those children today are now adults, and they are political consultants. I've seen them at Monday Night Politics at the African American Museum. And one told me, he said, you know, Ms. Craft nurtured us. She took them all through the political system, the things that you need to do, how you need to write your council people, how to attend council meetings and what have you. So Ms. Craft groomed some of our political consultants for leadership today. All right, so let's go back now, Matt. You can go back right there. We'll go back to Juneteenth. Juneteenth. One more. Juneteenth. One more. Okay. So next month on June 19th, we will be observing Juneteenth, which we hope will become a national holiday thanks to the work of the lady in Fort Worth. I'm sorry, I haven't seen your mom. I can't remember her name right now. But at any rate, I'll know it when we get to the Q&A. I'll be able to tell you. But Juneteenth at Comanche Crossing. This is in Mahia, Texas. And my brother-in-law would go down there every year for that observance. But there was a tragedy there where some young African Americans were in a canoe, and the police got them and arrested them, put them in a canoe, and they drowned. So that it kind of died down after that, but it has been revitalized. But Juneteenth here in Dallas is celebrated at a number of places. I know DeSoto has a celebration. We have one in Dallas, and they're in different communities, at which time we get together. And Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to be effective January 1, 1863. However, those enslaved in Texas were not told about their freedom. And that is because the plantation owners wanted to keep them doing some more crops, bringing in that cotton crop, bringing in whatever crops they had. But finally, General Granger read Order Number 3, and we'll show that shortly. Matt, see if you can find that General Order Number 3. That is at the Hall of State in Fair Park, yes. And he read it in Galveston at Ashton Villa. And the reason why he read it from there is because Ashton Villa was the headquarters for the Confederacy in Texas. So there were 11 states that were part of the Confederacy, and Texas was one of those. But finally on June 19th. And June 19th is celebrated throughout the nation. In Texas, it is a legal holiday. Governor Clements made it a legal holiday. And he also reenacted the gas chamber. Somebody got killed. But at any rate, it is a legal holiday in Texas. All over the country, people observe Juneteenth either as a commemoration like Flag Day or something like that, except for 3 states. But still, the people there do something in those communities. Okay, we can have another slide now. I think Martin Luther King at the People's Baptist Church in South Dallas. Right there. Dr. King's visit to Dallas was at the People's Baptist Church, which is in People's Missionary Baptist Church, which is in South Dallas. Rumor has it there was some tension about him coming here, but of course you see the audience. I won't talk about the rumor, but anyway, another time that Dr. King came here was on March 17, 1966. And so at the Dallas Civil Rights Museum, we're housed at the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center. I always like to do something on his actual birthday. The 3rd Monday in January is the official holiday, but I always like to do something on his actual birthday. So that particular year, 2016, the students from SMU came over and presented us a picture with Dr. King. And I go and Google it. And it's only one picture they have of Dr. King at the podium speaking. Now, you know, that would never happen today. There would be, everybody would snap it. But out of that speech, there was only one. And the student body government, the president of the student body, died just before we had this event, but his wife came. And then the person who picked up Dr. King from the airport back in 1966 also came. So this was, and then the student government leaders came, the president of the student government, the overall SMU body government, and then the president of the Black student body came. So that was really good. But Dr. King has been here a few times. All right, may I have my next slide, please? Okay, these are people protesting at the state fair, I believe. Yep. I see the state fair of Texas. Because, as I said, they could only go out there on um, Negro Day, and it was finally changed later. And and also with Juneteenth, that was another time they could go out there. The fair wasn't going on, but they could go out to Fair Park, and it was only on Juneteenth, and that was finally stopped in the 50s. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we talked about that. All right. So the Dallas Civil Rights Museum, we're housed at the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center in South Dallas. And the picture on what we're looking, when we look at it on our left, the four of us, George Keaton, the tall one, the tallest one in the picture, in the white shirt, is the founder of Remembering Black Dallas. Now, we used to have Black Dallas Remembered, and we used to meet at the Juanita Craft House, but he's the sponsor of Remembering Black Dallas. Someone earlier mentioned lynchings, and Alan Brooks was hung in Dallas, and there's a Martyrs Park, and George has been instrumental in making sure that we observe his tragic death every year. This weekend, in fact, Saturday, we leave for Tulsa to go there for the observance of the massacre in 1921. He also conducts tours all over Dallas and in Irving and in other communities that you may not know about. So this is a good way to know about Dallas and see the community and the thriving African American community. So up next to it, where you see somebody in a red blouse, that's a children's a group that came to visit. We have school visits from homeschoolers. One lady just Googled homeschoolers, and maybe 50 of them came. So we scheduled it. We have children who've come from Denton. We have children who have come from all over. And then down there where you see a teal, which is my favorite color, that is Slim Thug, a rapper from Houston. And I think he's collaborated with Beyonce on something. So one day he was at the center giving away tennis shoes. And I said, I can't let this man be here and not see the museum. So I took him on a tour of the museum, highlighting different things. And we say that at our museum, we're your dress rehearsal for going to the National African American Museum in DC, because we cover a lot of significant civil rights events. For example, we know about Mrs. Parks being sitting down, refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. But she was a secretary of the NAACP there in Montgomery. She was also responsible for going to investigate women who had been raped or accosted or whatever. She was responsible for that. And one case she did go investigate was that of Reese Taylor. And this happened on September 3rd, 1944. And Miss Taylor was raped by 7 white men in Alabama. Now, Oprah Winfrey received the Cecil B. DeMille's Award one year during the Academy Award. And she talked about Reese Taylor. And there is a documentary about her. But I was just highlighting some of the significant things. And on this panel, we also have a map of voting throughout in different states. For example, in the 1940s, looking at the census, in the 1940s, perhaps, I think I'm just going by memory, say 5.3% people, blacks were registered in Texas, and we show you in other states. But the reason why the Mississippi Summer Project was in Mississippi, because only 0.4% of blacks were registered in Mississippi. Then And then, oh, there's the iconic statue of Dr. King in front of the Martin Luther King. Well, it sits between the Martin Luther King Building A, which is the core service building, and the library. And so we always like for our group to take a picture there before they leave. And we've been very creative with the space. We don't have a lot of space. We started out in this room where you see George, the four of us. We started out there, and then we got creative, and we go down the corridor. And then we've gotten creative, and the center manager, Mrs. Pamela Jones, has allowed us to put information in the lobby as well. So you can contact me if you'd like to have a tour of the museum. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so, we're talking about racism, white supremacy, and what have you. So Nicole Hannah Jones, and you can Google this, has been denied tenure at the University of North Carolina. Our governor of the state of Texas has even spoken about this because she is the author of the 1619 Project. When it came out, 2 years, 2019? Yeah, 2019. Everybody was scrambling around to find a New York Times because they had a supplement in it all about the 1619 Project. Some schools, including Texas, and you may have seen it on the news, some parents don't want this introduced into the school system. They don't want critical theory introduced into the school system because they don't want the white children to learn about, well, I can't say what they don't want. My supposition is that they don't want their children to learn the truth, okay? And so I would like for you to Google that. In addition, I'd like for you to read the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. She came to SMU. They honored her. They gave her an honorary degree in, I think, 2014. In February of this year, St. Philip's School had her there for their signature fundraiser lecture. So, but this book really lets you know things that happen. And there's something that happened in Austin, but I think my time is up, so I'm going to stop. I see Miss O'Neill. Okay.
Thank you so much. And I did not want to come
Wait,
on.
let me leave you with this. Let me just leave you. Can I leave you with a quote?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Here's the quote I would like for you. I want to leave you with. And it's by Baba Dioum. He is a Senegalese forester engineer, and he gave this quote at a meeting in India in New Delhi in 1968. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. And that's what we're doing here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I really didn't even want to turn my camera on because I haven't been able to travel over the past year, and you all are giving me everything that I've missed from traveling and just researching history. And so we will save it for Q&A. So we will definitely come back to you because I think a question popped up for you as well in the chat. And so with that, we're going to move to our last and final presenter, Renee Martinez, for our last presentation. And then after that, we will open it up for Q&A. And so Renee Martinez has served the public education community for the past 47 years as a community advocate and education. An original tri-ethnic committee chair, Mr. Martinez was appointed by the United States District Judge William M. Taylor to assist with implementing the 1971 School Desegregation Court Order. He also served as the co-chair of the Dallas Alliance Education Task Force. In this role, Mr. Martinez co-authored the 1976 School Desegregation Court Order on behalf of the U.S. District and Dallas Independent School District. Currently, he's an adjunct professor at Dallas College, training aspiring teacher aides. Mr. Martinez was also an adjunct professor at SMU and Texas A&M Commerce at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, and was the founding director for the Sistema Universitario Ana G. Mendez, a dual language university, Dallas is tell you, I can only give a brief synopsis of everyone's bio, but the breadth and the depth of their experience, it is amazing, and it provides so much to what's happening today. So, Mr. Martinez, I am now going to turn it over to you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to just go straight into my presentation and try not to repeat or replicate some of the comments and some of the data that's been given. My friend Beto has listed a lot of demographic information that I'm going to kind of exclude because he really gives the data very well. My presentation is going to be coming from the practitioner standpoint, someone that was born and raised here in Dallas and have been active for over 45 years in the community. Ms. Rogers mentioned Dr. King's visit to Dallas in 1966. I was there. I was at McFarland Auditorium with Jerry Levias, the only African-American at SMU. I was a student also, and about 15 students from Bishop College that were brought to hear Dr. King at McFarland by my sister-in-law, Kay Martinez. We were the only minorities in that auditorium. So I actually was able to see and hear Dr. King as a sophomore at SMU. I also had the privilege and honor to work with A. Maceo Smith. I was at his funeral where Thurgood Marshall attended in South Dallas. I worked with Al Lipscomb, Zan Holmes, J.B. Jackson, George Allen. So the perspectives that I'm going to give you all come from my personal experience in being involved in those settings with key African-American leaders and Hispanic leaders as we progress through history in our city. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of Dallas, the Mexican-American community. I'm going to pivot to key events that I think shaped our city, both in Black and Brown relations and dealing with each other. Those collaborations were important. And then talk a little bit about those events and how they've shaped the events of now, the events that are impacting on education. Again, I'm not going to repeat the demographics, but I do want to say one thing that Dr. Calderon mentioned. Mexicans and Mexican Americans are not immigrants, as Dr. Calderon very vividly said. The borders shifted on us in Texas. Annexation shifted where we lived and what we were and what we owned. When he cited all the statistics on lynchings and deaths of Mexicans, you're probably saying, well, why? Well, it was because land was being taken away from Mexican Americans in the Valley in South Texas because they were not paying taxes, because Mexicans did not know that taxes had to be paid on land. So sheriffs and Texas Rangers were sent out and arrested these people and took their land and lynched and killed and shot Mexicans. So in essence, there hasn't been immigration. It's been a shifting of populations, of movement of people from Mexico to South Texas to Central Mexico. And it was very well said by Dr. Calderon. The other point that I want to make before I get into the presentation is what Dr. Dulaney said about Dallas missing a big portion of the civil rights period. I like to say that Dallas really skipped the civil rights period of the 60s, and I'll allude to that. And of course, previous speakers have alluded to that. Going back to a history of our community in Dallas, the Mexican community in Dallas, based on archives, based on the Mexican American Historical Society and their resources, basically cite that the population began to grow in the 1880s, 1890s, and then in the turn of the century. There's a map, Matt, if you can shift, that shows different barrios in Dallas. I think it's this one exactly. Kind of tells you where those populations were and where they spread to. They started in Little Mexico around American Airlines Center, and that's where I grew up. And then they shifted to City Park. They shifted to West Dallas. They shifted to Oak Cliff and really grew from there. So who were these people? My parents and my relatives came to Dallas in the 1920s. They moved from Mexico in 1917. I have the crossing bill that my grandfather paid when he crossed the border in Laredo. So that was a movement of people coming to this community. Why did they come to Dallas? They came to Dallas. Many of them were the ones that were building the railroads in North Texas. Many of them worked in the textile factories, in the huge laundries that existed. My mother and my aunt worked in those laundries in the 20s. The hotels that were being built, my father worked at the Adolphus and the Baker Hotel. So the hotels and restaurants, early restaurants, hired and employed a lot of these workers, the railroads. And we lived in the barrios in this particular map that is shown. And again, when the Mexican Revolution began in 1910 and 20, then you saw a major shift of population where there were maybe a few thousand in Dallas around the turn of the century. The revolution created thousands more to move. The latest book by Jeff Gwynne, which is called War on the Border, cites tremendous statistics and rationale behind these movements of populations from the border to South Texas, to Central Texas, to Austin, and then to Dallas. And it's a good book to read in terms of those things, in terms of how Mexicans not only moved throughout the state, but how they were treated. So let's fast forward now to the 20s, 30s, moving up to 30s and 40s in terms of Dallas. What was happening? Again, Little Mexico was growing to other barrios. We had Little Mexico being a predominantly Jewish community at one time, and then it shifted. Mexicans in this part of the community that I grew up went through a lot of discrimination in schools, especially discrimination in jobs, public accommodations, in pools. We didn't have swimming pools, access to swimming pools. But education was a big focal point. And I want to begin there. If you can shift, Matt, to the key events. So, as I said earlier, the 60s and the civil rights period of the 60s kind of went by Dallas. Sure, there were things that are within the African American community, things were happening in South Dallas. But among Mexican Americans, there was a lot of tension and energy brewing because of the lack of public education that was fair, that was equitable, and that was given to everyone in the same community. Those of us in Little Mexico attended segregated schools, and they were not de jure segregation, it was de facto. Matt, if you could shift to the bullets on the events, the key elements. Keep going. So the first major event that took place, and I want to cite that, the next slide, please, was, as I cited, education was a pivotal point, was a TASB desegregation litigation that began in 1970 and went on to 71. Education was a focal point. This was the suit that you've got to remember that in 1954, you had the Brown decision. And Dallas schools had not desegregated since 1954. There had been a stair-step plan, grade by grade level plan. Schools were not desegregated. So it took TASB to file suit in Dallas courts, in the court of William Taylor, to bring about the first desegregation case of 1971. And that lasted through 1980 in terms of appeals, modifications, changes, things that were added. And then finally, 1976, where the Dallas Plan got introduced by the Dallas Alliance, where we added, I was a part of that, we added a lot more renovations and innovations in buildings and innovations in programs such as the magnet schools, the Singleton ratio that desegregated all the faculty in Dallas, all the administrators in Dallas, because prior to 1971, black teachers were teaching in black schools. Prior to 1970-71, there were no black administrators. Prior to 1970, the schools were segregated. I always say, I never attended Dallas public schools until, and was with a black student until 1966, 65, when I attended SMU. And that was one student that was African American, and that was Jerry Levice. So Dallas schools were segregated. TASB was the first pivotal step in terms of desegregation. Next slide, please. Plyer versus Doe. I was also involved in this case. In the TASB case, I was, as I was told earlier, I was chair of the triathlete committee with Zan Holmes. Zan Holmes was the first chair, I was the second chair. With Plyer versus Doe, this particular case was one in which the state of Texas had a regulation that stated that children of undocumented workers could not attend public schools. And MALDEF filed suit prior to 1982 and finally led to the Supreme Court ruling of Plyer versus Doe. Plyer was an East Texas case, went all the way to the Supreme Court and basically did away with that mandate from the state of Texas. This was the precursor for things to come in terms of undocumented children and their education. It was a precursor to what happened later in the 80s and 90s, where Trustee Flores passed a ruling with the Dallas College that allowed undocumented students to attend Dallas College DCCD without paying tuition. Later at the state level, the Noriega bill did the same thing. But Plyer versus Doe was the precursor to all these events. And then, of course, later under President Obama, the DACA executive order took place. Plyer, again, was the precursor to this. I was fortunate to be involved, fortunate enough to get involved in terms of providing some temporary schools for kids before the decision came down in 1982. Next slide, please, Mike. This is the headlines of the Dallas Morning News in 2006. As I stated earlier, immigration, we didn't really immigrate to this part of the country. Mexicans came to the northern part of the state, the central part of the state, in migration waves for different reasons. In the 80s, they came because of the Reagan amnesty law change. Thousands and thousands of Mexicans became citizens. And then the backlash took place in the turn of 2001, 2002, 2003, that led to this particular immigration march. There was a lot of things going on in Washington in terms of the type of legislation that was going to curb immigration nationwide. And again, I was involved with Hector Flores, Domingo Garcia, and others to demonstrate the toxic nature of the legislation that was going on in Washington. Very similar to the legislation that's going on throughout the country right now on suppressing the vote. But this was directed at immigration reform. We organized a march. It was not 200,000. Police reports stated that it was close to 600,000 people that marched on that day in Dallas. Probably the largest civil rights march in the history of our country. Why was it important? It was important because it was not just Mexican Americans marching. It was Latinos from other countries. It was African Americans. It was Anglos. Everybody came together to demonstrate their unity and the position of pushing for comprehensive immigration reform. That was 2006. So what have we gotten from all those particular events? The demographic changes have are very evident. When I cited 1970, 71, the Latino community or the Hispanic community, and specifically the Mexican community in Dallas, was 8% of the schools and about 7% of the city. This particular slide shows you now, and Beto very vividly showed the growth projectile of the Latino community. We were 8% in the 70s. In the schools now, we are 73%. We were about 6, 7% in the city and county. We're now 43, 44%. So the demographic shift, because of our age, because of continuing migrations of Mexicans and then other Latinos in the 50s, 60s, and 70s from other Latin American countries, has added to that growth. Next slide, please. So I cited some events that I think have brought us together. I mentioned Amacia Smith, Al Lipscomb, Zan Holmes, leaders in Dallas that were working with Latino and Mexican American leaders side by side. And I mentioned a few events that took place. Some of you probably have not heard of them. The Michael Moorhead shooting, the Santo Rodriguez shooting. We talked about the DISD court case. Those shootings were examples of what was going on. And there were more, by the way. There were more than just those two. Those were the most classic. So fast forward to where we are now in terms of Black Lives Matter. Police were shooting Latinos and Blacks in the back of the head, running away every month. And so those events, those incidents brought us together as Blacks and Browns to march, to demonstrate, to get rid of certain chiefs of police, to bring about change in terms of some reform in the recruitment and hiring of the police. And so those were the things that were taking place in the 70s and 80s that brought Blacks and Browns to work together. Now, was there tension? Was there discord? Was there disagreements? Absolutely. Because if you couple all these events and going into the 80s and 90s, the demographics changing, where Hispanics were 8% one day, and 5 years, 10 years later, there were 20 and 30 and 40%. The Black population is decreasing. So the numbers were changing. And a lot of people were saying, well, it's my turn. It is now the time for us to not only work together, but to say who has the numbers, who doesn't have the numbers. And so there was a lot of rhetoric going on during that period of time to create some tension, some disagreements, but still forging together and working together as two. Next slide, please. So what did we get out of these particular challenges and events and things that happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s? In schools, when I mentioned CASB, the Dallas Alliance, you can see that there were things that came out of it. The magnet schools, which are some of the best schools in the nation at Townview, the Arts Magnet, choice schools that are developing now, dual language programs. We have the largest dual language program right now in the nation. All the elementary schools in Dallas literally have either one-way or two-way dual language. That started in 1971, by the way, with bilingual programs. Early college in high schools, and now the PTech high schools, career institutes, partnerships between DISD and Dallas College. These are innovative. These are things that are going on in our community that people from all over the nation are coming to witness, and they use us as best practices. What are some other things that came out? And I mentioned them already. The in-resident tuition that came about prior, the Noriega legislation that came out in Austin, and then of course now DACA. Fast forward to now, what's going to be happening with DACA? What's going to be happening with comprehensive immigration reform? So these are things that started in the 70s in Dallas and in other cities, have grown, and now they're going to be ongoing challenges in terms of going forward. Next slide. Okay, so where are we now? As a community of Mexican Americans, Beto mentioned very clearly, 83 to 85% of the Dallas community is Mexican. I use Mexican American, I use Latino, I use Hispanic. The remaining 16, 17% is Puerto Rican, it's Cuban, and of course, a big chunk is Salvadorian from Guatemala and Honduras. People that are coming as recently as the past 10, 15 years, and now recently even more with the children on the border, which were predominantly from Central America. But the predominant population in Dallas of Latinos is of Mexican descent. Okay, that's my presentation, and I'll be here to answer any questions.
So here's what I know for sure from all four of these presentations. Number one, each of you are needed in the community to continue to share this history, and it is our responsibility to take this history and do something with it. 2 hours was not enough. That's what I know for sure, just hearing this. This is the beginning of a conversation, but more importantly, thankfully, we do have 2 additional sessions, 2 discussions following this one over the next 2 weeks that sets the foundation for conversation. And I think this is the part that we really needed, this context to lay that foundation for all of it. So I again want to thank the 4 of you for bringing this information, because I am blown away. What we know is what we know. What we know is what has been taught to us. But as I mentioned to someone in chat, this is the reason why I travel. The reason why I'm sitting here in awe is because you don't always get this out of textbooks. You get this wisdom from people that have researched the information and can present it in a way that helps us to realize, especially as we're looking at groups of people. We're looking at the Black community, and we're also looking at the Mexican community and what that really has meant to the city of Dallas. So I know we don't have a lot of time for questions and answers, but I do want to make sure that we get some of them out, and I want to defer to the audience before I ask my question. So there was one that came in earlier, and it says, can you please ask Dr. Calderon what the significance is of Cinco de Mayo to the United States? There is an important link to the Civil War. While this holiday is widely celebrated, it is seen as a reason to party, with most not knowing what the real significance is for the country and for an important linkage between the Mexican community and African Americans especially.
Can you hear me now? Yes. The Cinco de Mayo was the first battle that Mexicans won. And there was a follow-up war, if you will, in Mexico. Another occupation force, the United States, occupied Mexico City. Mexico City was the first foreign capital that U.S. military forces occupied, and they were there for months until the treaty was finally signed and approved by the Senates of both countries in May or June of 1848. But the war was an anti-colonial war on the part of Mexicanos. France, claiming that it was due debt that had not been paid, decided to occupy and attempt to make of Mexicans and Mexico a colony of and take the rest of the territory that the United States had decided it did not want in 1848. And in part, the United States did not take all of Mexico. There was an all of Mexico movement in the US, because what are you going to do with 8 million Mexicans who are essentially undesirable peoples that we wish not to make part of this country. And so in part, it was the racism that drives the limitations on setting the border where it did. The U.S. still manages to take over half of the Mexican territory that Mexico claimed. But the French brought 40,000 soldiers to Mexico and fight a war from 1862 to 1867. And Mexicans are victorious in defeating a very trained, experienced military force, you know, that had fought in Southeast Asia and in Europe and all sorts of in Africa and all sorts of campaigns, colonial campaigns. And the Mexicans won the war, but the first military victory was Cinco de Mayo, 1862, in the city of Puebla, in the state of Puebla, and it was won. It was won by a Mexican who had actually been born here in Texas, a general, a young general in his early 30s, by the name of Ignacio Zaragoza. And what's interesting also, because this is 1862 to 1867, is that the Mexico had legally abolished slavery in 1829. 40 years, 30 years before the US. And so when the border is established by the United States after the war in the middle of the century, the border becomes a haven for freedom, for the desire to escape injustice. And so you have African Americans from Louisiana, from Arkansas, from these adjacent, and from Texas itself, and who are fleeing towards the the now U.S. Mexico border, because if they can get to Mexico, they can earn their freedom and be free of slavery in Mexico. What is the name of the Puerto Rican playwright who wrote Hamilton? His name escapes me right now, but he, for example, is a descendant in part of one of those Africans who flees to Mexico, interestingly enough, in his own genealogy. So, during the 1850s, you have this movement south toward the border, west and south toward the border of Texas, in order to enter Mexico by untold number enslaved African Americans. And one of the responses here in Texas by the white community, by those who condone and endorse slavery as an institution, is, for instance, the mass expulsion that we have of Mexican communities in Matagorda County, in the city of Austin. In the 1850s, Mexicans are expulsed or run out of the city twice in the 1850s, because whites believed that Mexicans were a danger for the preservation of slavery, because they would befriend and engage in this movement to freedom. And so Mexicans are at the receiving end of this insistence on the preservation of the institution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calderon. And I placed in the chat, Hamilton was written by Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Lin-Manuel Miranda is descended in part from one of these African Americans who escapes
Thank you. So I'm going to, in the essence of time, before I turn it back over to Matt, I want to ask this question because I do think that it's important. Can we, from your perspectives and the history that each of you has provided today, can we truly get to the point of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, without addressing the past? Because it often seems that people pick up on what feels right, and there's no acknowledgement for the past to actually understand the justice that's needed to move forward. So to all of you, or one of you or two of you, can we really achieve this point of DEI as it's become trendy without facing the past and true justice of what has happened to our communities here in Dallas?
I want to jump in on that. I think you learn from the past. And you can pick and choose what you want to learn from the past. I like to pick the good things from the past. I like to pick the people that I was with at times that taught me things in a positive way. So history says a lot of things to us going forward with the challenges that we have.
I'd like to add that we need to study the past because it accounts for the reasons why we have laws the way they are, why there is segregation, and now we have desegregation. So we have to look at the laws, why housing is like it is, why there's not a number of races living in the same neighborhood. That we have to look at the legal system as to why we're like we are before we can move forward.
Yes.
Yeah, let me just jump in real quick and say that history is part of the important subject that we teach. That part of the problem has been, and of course we see it today with these Southern legislatures trying to stifle the teaching of history and to stifle the teaching of truth. And so I always believe that if we teach the past truthfully, it will help us come to understand each other. One of the things that has happened historically is that white children are taught their history and they grow and develop and believe in their greatness and strength. And then, of course, they neglect the teaching of the history of Mexican Americans and women and African Americans. And so, indeed, they're deprived of their history and don't know of their past greatness and their past achievements. So, we must teach history. I'm going to give you a quote like Emma. Dr. Nick said, of all of our studies, history is the most important. Once you see how other people have done what they have and how they achieved their greatness, you will understand what you need to do to achieve greatness.
But let me add one other point, and you said it, Professor. You got to teach history accurately and correctly. I
Yes.
served the committee to do away with the Confederate monuments, and there were very few people on that panel that knew anything about the lost cause, okay, and
Yeah.
why those monuments were built, because that part of history, people don't like to hear about the lost cause. So it's got to be taught accurately. And fast forward to right now, to what's going on in Austin, in terms of doing away, teaching history from that perspective.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
My takeaway is, understanding our sources of discomfort is the only way that we can truly get to a place of equitable inclusion and support for everyone across the community, if that's what we're really trying to achieve. And so with that being said, I want to thank each of you for your time today. I want to thank each of you for your presentations. This is what we all need. Those of us that may be from Texas and those of us that may not be from Texas, this is the history that we all need to understand how to move this city forward to ensure that there's equitable access for everyone that are residents and do business with the city of Dallas. I want to thank you all for your time today, and I want to thank UNTD and Dallas College for inviting me to moderate these sessions, because as a student of all of this, this has filled me today. And so with that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Professor Matt Houston.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, panelists, for an amazing discussion. I'm taking notes here on this end, and multiple pages of notes. And so you all four of you will receive a follow-up from me. But I definitely want to thank you all for investing your time, not only in this program, but investing in your time and energy and spirit to the community. Quite honestly, a lot of people who are working for their communities, whether it's the African American community or the Mexican American or Latinx community, really aren't able to cross communicate with one another because of all of the stress and the issues with our community. And so having discussions like this to understand the historical context, that we have more that are similar than there are different, is very significant. And we wanted to provide this as a framework so that we can continue our discussion next week. I want to let everyone know, I want to invite you for personally to attend the next 2 weeks events, as we are going to discuss the present in DEI in Dallas and the future of DEI in North Texas on June 3rd and June 10th, respectively. We would love for you to attend. I also would like to thank our moderator, Kim. Thank you for being able to effectively provide a venue, a space where we can have a constructive conversation. This will not go in vain. We are recording this session, and the goal for us is for mass distribution, especially in Dallas, so that people can have data points across North Texas. Secondly, I would like to thank all the committee members that is headed by Dr. James Aguazaki, Director of the Urban Search Institute. He, along with Marisol Romani, who is the Chief Director of Diversity at Dallas College, and Deanna Flores, who is the trustee member of Dallas College, who is, I believe, is the chair of Dallas College still. I want to thank the three of you all for your leadership in this, and thank B. Martinez, Samaje Best, Dr. Karen Shumway, the Dean of the School of Business, as well as Rick Ortiz and Harrison Blair, the presidents of the Greater Dallas Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and Dallas Black Chamber of Commerce, to serve on this committee to create this event. We will love for you all to join us next week, as we are going to have a robust discussion the same time, 12 noon. If you haven't, please invite and share with your friends and network to register. And we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday. Thank you and have a great day.